My name is Narasimhan.
It's not working. I can just come up here and do it.
On behalf of the Water Resources
It's only
Center
about 4 or 5
Archives
slides, so it isn't that big a deal.
and the faculty who has
But tell me
been
since I'm-
instrumental in putting this colloquium together, it is my pleasure to welcome you all for this second colloquium this semester. Each semester we have 4 colloquia with some balance between humanities, social sciences, natural sciences, and engineering. We just identify distinguished, interesting speakers and let them tell us what they know. We don't have any special theme. And this is because water in California and water in general in many other parts of the world is not anymore just about water. It's not just anymore about water and human beings. It's about water in all living things. And as part of this colloquium in the past, we have had distinguished speakers talk about fish in California, both in the Northern California rivers as well as the little fish of the deserts of Southern California, which are fascinating in themselves. And today we are going to hear about creatures other than fish that live in water, which are equally fascinating. And the speakers are especially aware that they will pattern their speech in such a way that they can reach to everybody without too much of jargon, but they can go make all of us better educated about various aspects of water. With that, I invite Linda Vida, the director of our Water Resources Center Archives, to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Nari. Is it on? Okay, great. I just have a few brief announcements to make. We do send out a reminder about the colloquium series about a week before each lecture, and if you would like to be on that list, we have a sign-up sheet in the back. We used to pass around a sign-up sheet, but we're not doing that anymore. So now if you are new here, this is your first time, please sign up on the back. And we also have some brochures in the back. We have some of our colloquium brochures so that you'll know what who the remaining speakers are, and we also have our Water Resources Center Archives brochures. We have some postcards, actually, some free postcards that are of images that are in the archives. Those are also in the back. And we brought some free copies of our 2006 calendar, which we publish in cooperation with the Transportation Studies Library. This year it's more transportation focused, but next year it's going to be more water focused. And we also have something called, there's a picture of William Mulholland on it with a calendar, and it's an actual old ink blotter or something like that from the early 20th century. So it looks old, and it is old. And also, just to let you know that we do videotape every lecture, and it's available on streaming video on our website about 2 weeks after the lecture. So with that, announcements are over. I would like to introduce Andrew Cohen. Andrew is certainly no stranger to the Berkeley campus or to the Water Resources Center Archives. He came to Berkeley as an undergrad with an environmental sciences major, and after he received his bachelor's degree, he went on to get a PhD in the Energy Resources Group. He became the executive director of the Urban Creeks Council in Berkeley, and then director of East Bay Mud from '91 to '94. He then worked in Connecticut for a while, but he can clarify that if needed. But he is currently the director of the Biological Invasive Species Program at San Francisco Estuary Institute. And his dissertation, which is also at the Water Resources Center Archives, is entitled Biological Invasions in the SF Estuary, a Comprehensive Regional Analysis. So please welcome Andrew Cohen.
Does this mic work? Anyway, can you hear me? Well enough? Great. I want to start by thanking Linda and Paige Wooden for their help over the last couple of weeks. I put them through some paces because I had thought that my wife was going to give birth to our second son 2 weeks ago, but he delayed the process. And I wasn't sure I was going to be able to come tonight, but my son did arrive a week ago. So I've got a week-old newborn in the house, and if I fall asleep during the lecture, don't wake me. Let me check this out. The clouds of black smoke that billowed out from factories, trains, and steamships in the 19th century were universally regarded as signs of the progress of civilization and the betterment of mankind. It wasn't until the 20th century that we realized that these black clouds were a form of pollution, and the story of the environmental movement in the latter part of the 20th century is in large part the story of the recognition, analysis, and regulation of harmful chemical constituents in air emissions, water discharges, and pesticides. In the 21st century, however, the signature contaminant of the age is unlikely to be chemical, but rather will be biological pollutants. The ever rapidly increasing transportation of exotic species around the globe, including human diseases, and the release out of the laboratory and into the environment of genetically engineered organisms. Because we're only now coming to grips with this problem of biological pollutants, there is a lot of work to be done, both in science, in law, and in policy. And there are many opportunities for people working in those fields to have a large influence. And what I want to do tonight is talk a bit about exotic species, which is the field that I work in one ecosystem, the San Francisco Bay Delta, and to also describe some of the ways in which my work as a biologist in the area has opened up some opportunities for improving policy, both at the state level and the national level, and to some extent at the international level. So with that, let me go to the first slide. Is there a way of dimming the lights in this room? And we'll get this started. The backlights go down at all more? Is it slow enough? Let's see. Great, that's good. This is a slide of Broadway Wharf in San Francisco in the year 1852. This is the year in which Commodore John Sloat of the US Navy arrived from Washington on a special mission. His task was to pick a site for the first US naval base on the West Coast, and his orders directed him to find a site that was, quote, safe from attack by wind, by wave, by enemies, or by marine worm. This is the worm that the US Navy was worried about. This is the Pacific Coast shipworm, Bankia cetacea. A shipworm is actually a modified clam, and what it does is it bores its way into wood where it lives. This organism bores its way into wood like the pilings and other wood that holds up wharves and docks, and into wooden-hulled ships in those days. And the type of damage that it does is shown in this slide of the lower few feet of a piling that's been split in two. This piling was actually driven in and in place in the water near Oakland for about 5 months before it had become so infested with the Pacific Coast shipworm that it sheared off at the mudline. To avoid damage like this, Commodore Sloat, after examining the waters of San Francisco Bay, picked this site in the northern part of the San Francisco Bay on the shores of Mare Island for this naval base. Up here, the combined waters of the Napa River and the waters of the Sacramento-San Joaquin River moving down into the bay made the water so fresh that the Pacific Coast shipworm couldn't survive up here. And so what became the Mare Island Naval Shipyard was established at this site and thrived for many decades without attack by wind, wave, enemies, or marine worms until the year 1913, when an Atlantic shipworm that was more tolerant of fresh water showed up in San Francisco Bay and was actually first discovered in a piling here at Mare Island. Over the next few years, the Atlantic shipworm reproduced and became more abundant and ultimately came to the attention of the general public starting in the year 1919, when a major wharf, pier, or ferry slip collapsed into the water at a rate of one major structure every 2 weeks for a period of 2 years, until the entire maritime infrastructure of the northern part of San Francisco Bay had essentially been eaten through by this exotic marine shipworm. This is a slide of the municipal wharf and custom house at Benicia after it had been remodeled by the Atlantic shipworm. The damage in the northern part of San Francisco Bay over these 2 years, when escalated to current dollars, it comes out to somewhere between $2 and $20 billion worth of damage. And that doesn't include the damage elsewhere in the bay and the damage in other years. And all of this from the arrival of one exotic organism into this ecosystem. What I want to do now is take you on a quick tour around the San Francisco Bay Delta region, taking a look at the common organisms that we find out there today. And we're going to start by driving down University Avenue to the foot of University Avenue and going out to the Berkeley Marina and pull up a little styrofoam bumper, which is completely covered with a variety of marine organisms, what we call fouling organisms, things that attach to hard surfaces. And so what we see here are sea squirts from Asia, yellow sponges from the Atlantic, some bryozoans, a colonial organism from the Atlantic. Here's a warty brown sponge from Asia. In the middle here, these circles are a colonial sea squirt from the Atlantic. And underneath those circles up there in the middle, where the shadow of my finger is pointing, you can just make out the edge of a mussel shell. The mussel might be a native species, but it might also be a species from the Mediterranean. We can't tell them apart by looking. We have to do molecular genetic work. And so this is typical of what we find occurring on hard surfaces throughout the central part of San Francisco Bay, in that every organism, or virtually every organism, has come from some other part of the world. If we move upstream a little bit into San Pablo Bay, where the water tends to be more turbid from water coming down from the Sierra Nevada, and somewhat fresher, we find a different set of fouling organisms. This is, in this pan here, are these matted long strands of material that we find hanging off of buoys and docks. And what this is actually two organisms. Underneath the stems of this, as it were, are hydroids, which is the sedentary life stage of a jellyfish. This is a hydroid from the Atlantic, and it's covered over by this sort of tan encrusting material, which is a bryozoan from the Atlantic. And then crawling in amongst this by the thousands are little crustacean isopods, basically marine pill bugs, all of them coming from Asia. If we move into more protected waters in San Francisco Bay, around the margins of the bay and some of the lagoons around the edges of the bay, we often find the rocks coated with this white reef-like material, sometimes of pretty fair extent. This is made up of these white calcareous tubes, which are the home to a worm which is native to the Indian Ocean. And when we break these reefs of material apart, we find crawling in among the interstices in large numbers a little brackish water Atlantic crab. And then in the last decade or so, we've begun to find, since its arrival, the young of the Chinese mitten crab crawling in there as well. And so here we have the Chinese crab for the first time encountering the Atlantic crab under a canopy of tubes built by an Indian Ocean worm on the side of a dock in San Francisco Bay. A metaphor for the problem in one spot. Moving out onto other surfaces, into the marshes of San Francisco Bay, we see here two plants. This is on the shore of Bay Farm Island. San Francisco is in the background. In the back, the taller, darker, denser plant that's growing there is what biologist Don Strong refers to as the pushy, aggressive New York cordgrass, which is overgrowing and outcompeting our wimpy, laid-back California cordgrass shown in the foreground, and completely altering the marshes of San Francisco Bay for everything that lives there, because this is a very different environment living in here than it is living in here. And there are winners and losers among the native species, some things which do better and other things which do much worse. And there is currently well, I think by now probably multi-million-dollar, but anyway, fairly expensive program to try and manage cordgrass in San Francisco Bay that involves spraying large amounts of herbicide out into the marshes and ultimately out into the water as well, with whatever side effects there may be from that. If we move out beyond the marshes into the mudflats, we find that the most common clams in San Francisco Bay are the Japanese little neck clam, also known as the Manila clam, the Atlantic gem clam, and a more recent invader, what has generally been known as the Asian clam or overbite clam, Corbula amurensis, and I'll talk more about this one in a little bit. Also out on the mudflats, we find snails. All of these black dots here are what was the most common snail in San Francisco Bay for many decades, the Atlantic mud snail. But in the last 5 years or so, it seems to be being overtaken by an Asian bubble snail, which has recently arrived and which carries a parasite which can give a nasty rash to human beings. So a lot of common things out there turn out to be exotic. In 1998, Jim Carlton and I published a paper on the invasions in San Francisco Bay in which we analyzed some 234 exotic organisms that we knew of that were in the bay and delta and established here. Nowadays, the number, if we were to redo that list, would probably come out to somewhere between 250, 260 species. So we continue to discover more continue to arrive. The number of exotic organisms is pretty impressive, but even more impressive to me is the way they dominate many of the most common habitats in the bay. The muddy, soft bottom of the bay, the docks of the bay, as we showed, the brackish and freshwater zooplankton, some of the freshwater fish up in the upper delta. And in many of these habits, exotic organisms count for a large number, up to 100% of the common species, and very often more than 95% of the number of individuals or the biomass, the wet living weight of organisms out there, leading many to suggest that San Francisco Bay is the most invaded estuary in the world. How did all these things get here? Historically, there were 3 main mechanisms. Those following organisms that I showed in the early slides not only can grow on the sides of docks and buoys, but they also grow on the sides of ships. And this is one of the ways in which they have been transported around the world for a very, very long time. They first began being transported to San Francisco Bay in large numbers with the gold rush, when ships from all parts of the world converged on the bay to bring in people who were seeking their fortune here. And this is a poster advertising one such voyage leaving from Lewis Wharf in Boston to head for the gold fields in California. Many of the ships which made this voyage were not ships in the best of condition. They were old rust buckets, basically, not rust buckets because they were wooden hulls, but they were old wooden-hulled ships, rotted in many places, patched and repatched, limping on their last voyage to San Francisco Bay. And because this was the condition of the hulls, the many crevices and holes in the hull offered opportunities not only for attached organisms, but a lot of mobile organisms, crabs and the like, to also make their way to San Francisco Bay. When they got to San Francisco Bay, the passengers headed off for the gold fields, but in many cases, the crew did as well. And these old wrecks of ships were abandoned. This is Yerba Buena Harbor in 1851, showing it getting filled, essentially, with abandoned ships from all parts of the world who had brought people here who sought gold. And these ships stayed there. Some of them were used for storehouses or saloons or jails or other purposes. Eventually, they were all burned to the waterline, and the city of San Francisco was built out over them. But in the meantime, they sat here for decades, and the organisms that arrived with them had ample opportunity to colonize San Francisco Bay, and many of them did. Another major mechanism for moving organisms around and into San Francisco Bay was the Transcontinental Railroad. This is the celebration at Promontory Point, Utah, in 1869, when the line from the east met the line from the west, and they were joined by the driving of the Golden Spike. And in this next slide, we see the actual Golden Spike in 2 views with a leather covering over its point. And each side of the spike has an inscription on it. And I don't know if you can read it, but on the top view, the inscription says, "May God continue the unity of our country as this railroad unites the 2 great oceans of the world." And as if to make those words manifest, we immediately began packing up barrels of eastern oysters and loading them on the train in that first year of 1869 and shipping them across the country to be laid out in rearing beds in San Francisco Bay, staked out to keep bat rays out that fed on the oysters. And these young oysters brought in from the Atlantic were then reared up to market size. And when the tides came in and they were of a large enough size, they'd bring a barge in, tongue them up, and bring them into the markets of San Francisco Bay. The oysters never actually became established in San Francisco Bay. The waters are too cold for them to reproduce. But living in the oysters as parasites and epizoics, and living on the shells of the oysters and in the mud and the water and the barrels with which they were brought to San Francisco Bay, were many other organisms, and a number of them did become established in the bay and indeed spread to other bays along the coast. Another major mechanism, the third historically important mechanism, was the intentional introduction of fish, mainly from the eastern United States, also to some degree from Europe, because the early fisheries biologists found many of the fish populations of California not to their liking. The native fish populations of California are to a large extent based upon the sucker family and the minnow family of fish, and this was of not great appeal to the anglers of the day and the commercial markets of the day. And so what were brought in were fish belonging to the bass and the sunfish family, fish belonging to the catfish family, which didn't exist in California, and spread around, as well as many salmonid species to augment what was actually a pretty diverse salmonid fauna, and spread around California. And this is an early Fish and Game Commission truck. In the back are these modified milk cans, which are loaded with fish, and they're being spread around to the rivers of California. So these were the three major mechanisms for moving exotic organisms into San Francisco Bay in historic times. But all of them are either not operating today or operating at a much reduced rate. On ship hulls they came in. Fouling still exists on ship hulls. It can still be potentially a significant mechanism for moving organisms around the world, but its heyday was really in the days of wooden ships, of slower ship speeds, of ships spending long periods in port between voyages and accumulating large fouling communities and moving them around. So it still exists, but at a much reduced level than it did in the past. Oyster shipments were primarily in two periods, first from the Atlantic Ocean after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, and then that industry died out. And then for a decade before World War II, we brought in Japanese oysters. Again, the oysters didn't become established, but all the things living on the oysters and in the boxes in which the oysters were shipped, of those organisms, many of them did become established. And then fish stocking programs, one period after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad and another in the decades after World War II, when the development in the West and the increasing leisure time led the agencies to a great increase in the number of fish species that they tried to get established, sometimes successfully, in California and on the West Coast. So none of these mechanisms really are operating today at the level that they were or not operating at all, and yet when we go out, and this is what we did in our 1998 paper, and look at when these organisms arrived and as best we can tell and the rate at which they're arriving, we find that the cumulative curve of organisms is exponential, which means that they are coming in at a faster and faster rate all the time. And one way to characterize this is if we look at the period before 1960, we find a species coming in and becoming established about one every 55 weeks. And since 1960, it's about a new species every 14 weeks on average in the decade since 1960. We don't really know why this is. Some people think that maybe the bay is becoming more easily invaded, although there's no evidence on that one way or the other. But surely one of the big contributors is that in these decades of globalization that we have come up with some new mechanisms, some of them even more efficient than the old mechanisms for moving organisms around the world and doing so in larger quantities and at a faster rate. And the most infamous of those mechanisms is ship's ballast water. When a ship is about to embark on a voyage and it is empty of cargo or light in cargo, it sits very high in the water. And if a ship were to try and cross the ocean in this kind of configuration, it would easily be knocked over by wind or waves. And so to avoid that, a ship that isn't carrying much cargo will take aboard instead large quantities of water, store it in various holds aboard the ship, sink the ship down to a safe level in the water in which it can cross the ocean. And then having once completed the voyage and made it to the opposite side of the ocean or into another ocean where it's about to take on cargo, it will then pump that water out into the surrounding water, out into the surrounding environment. This process of using ballast water began in the latter part of the 1900s when steel-hulled ships, iron-hulled and steel-hulled ships, and steam-driven pumps came into use. But it has really increased over the years, and with the rise in international trade, a lot more ballast water has been moved really in the last several decades than in the decades before. But it was only about 15 years or so ago, maybe 20 years or so ago, that scientists began looking at what was in this ballast water that was being moved around the world. They went on board ships, opened the hatches, dropped down plankton nets, pumped out water, and sampled what was in it. And what they found was a great diversity and sometimes large numbers of virtually every type of marine organism was being carried around in what were essentially large ocean-going aquariums. This, for example, is a larval mussel. Many organisms that we know of as attached or crawling or swimming, large swimming organisms as adults have a larval life stage in which they are microscopic or near microscopic and drifting in the water. And in this stage, they can easily be pulled aboard by the pumps, ballast pumps, and into the hulls of tanks. And this is a larval mussel that was collected from the ballast tank of a wood chip carrier that had loaded ballast water in Japan and was arriving in Coos Bay, Oregon. And here it is swimming towards the camera. And most of these organisms in the ballast tanks are small, larval stages or small adult organisms. But every now and then, whoops, wrong way, we get a larger organism, such as this Israeli mullet that biologist Linda McCann has gleefully netted out of the water remaining in a ballast tank of a coal carrier that has just made the voyage from Haifa to Chesapeake Bay. And so occasionally we get big things as well. In San Francisco Bay, our poster child for ballast water invasions is this clam, Corbula amurensis, sometimes called the Asian clam, although there are at least 7 Asian clams established in the system, so that's a little confusing. Sometimes called the overbite clam because one valve is a little bit bigger than the other, and so it has a bit of an overbite. This clam was first collected on the Pacific coast of North America by a biology class out on a field trip, a biology class at the Diablo Valley Community College. They were out there for a day. They pulled up some samples from the bottom, and they collected 3 of these clams in October of 1986. By the summer of 1987, it was the most abundant clam throughout the northern part of San Francisco Bay, occurring in average densities of 2,000 clams per square meter and reaching peak densities of about 50,000 clams per square meter. At these densities, the clam essentially paves the bottom. Here is a piece of the bottom of San Francisco Bay, and all of these white things you see there are this clam, which had not existed in San Francisco Bay 5 years before this picture was taken. And this is what the bottom of San Francisco Bay came to look like over virtually the entire bay. This clam eats by filtering phytoplankton primarily, also some small zooplankton out of the water. Phytoplankton are the microscopic plants that float in the water that form an important base of the food web in estuaries and in the northern part of San Francisco Bay, which I'm going to talk about now. Because what this clam did was it became so abundant throughout San Francisco Bay and was such an effective filter feeder that it was calculated that it was filtering out the entire volume of water over most of the bay between once and twice a day. In the northern part of San Francisco Bay, we had been studying that ecosystem intensively, much more so than in the southern part of San Francisco Bay, because of concerns over water withdrawals and what that was going to do to the ecosystem of San Francisco Bay and to the fisheries of San Francisco Bay. And so we have a long data set which shows that in the northern part of San Francisco Bay, there were annual blooms of the phytoplankton, which are the base of the food web up in the water column. There's these microscopic plants. They bloom in large numbers every spring. They're eaten by small crustaceans called copepods. The copepods, in turn, are eaten by larger crustaceans called mysid shrimp. The small fish eat the copepods and mysid shrimp. The big fish eat the small fish, your classic food chain. What this slide shows, the slide from the US Geological Survey, it's 10 years of data. The green is measurements of chlorophyll, and there's data going back for quite a while, ways back, which shows this phenomenon here is every year a large bloom in the phytoplankton as measured by the chlorophyll in the water. The pink is the biomass of this clam, Corbula amurensis, arrived right about here, became abundant enough to show up in these sampling here and stayed abundant, and the phytoplankton blooms disappeared. So everything we knew about how the system operated from a long period of study before suddenly was no longer applied because this was a different ecosystem operating in an entirely different way. And the predictions were that with the collapse of the phytoplankton, we would start to see collapses further up the food chain. That did not happen obviously or quickly, but it does appear to have happened. One of the things that has happened is that as the copepods that existed here before declined, which they did, new copepods came in from Japan, brought in ballast water, became established, became abundant, then they declined, and new copepods came in, Yet another species from Japan became the new most abundant species, then declined. But overall, a gradual decline in the numbers of copepods in the bay. Same thing with the mysid shrimp. The native mysid shrimp essentially disappears. Japanese mysid shrimp come in, but gradual decline in the number. So there's replacement for a little while, but declines over time. And then in the last couple of years, what we've been hearing about is the big catastrophe in the delta is the crash in three pelagic fish species, fish which feed on copepods and mysid shrimp, which are no longer there. And so while it's not sure that this clam is what caused the pelagic fish species, there are a number of different possibilities being looked at. It seems to be the leading contender for causing that crash. It took 20 years since the clam arrived, which nobody expected, but we do seem to be seeing that effect now. Of course, every cloud has its silver lining. So while this clam has taken food out of the water column, there's now a lot more food down in the bottom, all these clams there. So something must be eating them, and something is. Sturgeon that feed on the bottom, diving ducks that go down and feed on the bottom. Their guts are filled with these clams. So they should be doing well, except that this clam, it turns out, sequesters selenium in its body at a higher level than the clams that had existed in San Francisco Bay before, at levels that are high enough to give doses to the things that feed on it that from laboratory studies seem likely to cause reproductive defects. Some of you may remember, I believe it was in the 1980s, the Kesterson National Wildlife Refuge in the Central Valley was closed because of selenium contamination, selenium being brought in from agricultural wastewater discharges. Deformed birds were found, fish were dying off, and the entire wildlife refuge had become basically a wildlife trap, poisoning the animals that lived there. And so they closed the refuge, scared the wildlife off, filled in the ponds, and there is no Kesterson Wildlife Refuge anymore. The same thing, to some extent, may be happening with the organisms that feed on the bottom of San Francisco Bay, now feeding on a very abundant clam that sequesters selenium at a high level in its tissues. How are we doing here? I want to talk quickly about a couple of other vectors, other mechanisms for moving organisms around the world. This is Paul Raquel, a California Department of Fish and Game biologist, who was very surprised one day to pull in his net in the delta and find a Mississippi alligator gar in the net. We believe that this was somebody's pet fish that got a little too big for its aquarium, and this does happen many times in different parts of the world. A number of aquarium species have become established. Mostly this is a problem of warmer water areas. Most of the aquarium fish are adapted to warmer waters, and so there are many more aquarium introductions in Southern California and Texas and Florida and Mexico. But there are some throughout California. And mostly it's a problem of freshwaters, but increasingly we're seeing a rise in saltwater aquariums and increasingly a threat of saltwater invaders. The most famous of these is this green alga, green seaweed, Caulerpa taxifolia, which is a tropical seaweed which was bred in Germany to live in aquariums because it's very attractive, and became an aquarium plant of choice, sold and used in both public aquaria and in private aquariums throughout the world, and in the 1980s introduced into the Mediterranean, perhaps intentionally, perhaps accidentally, by the aquarium at Monaco. And from there it spread primarily eastward and ultimately reached the Adriatic Sea. This seaweed, which forms essentially a monoculture over all types of bottom, growing over seagrass beds, growing over rocky reefs, growing over coral organisms, reducing them to a monoculture, now covers tens of thousands of acres in the Mediterranean, is one of the great ecological catastrophes of the Mediterranean. It contains in its tissues a class of chemicals called caulerpanines, which are toxic to most species, and so not too many things eat it. In 1998, I became aware that although this invasion had been going on for over a decade in the Mediterranean, one of the big Mediterranean catastrophes, banned in many countries in Europe as in Australia, nevertheless was readily available for purchase in aquariums in the United States, and decided to, with the encouragement of some colleagues, prepare a petition to try and get this listed as a prohibited species in the United States. And so I drafted this petition to the Secretary of the Interior. We got over 100 marine scientists to sign it. I was told it would never be listed by the agency staff because the Federal Noxious Weed Act, which was the relevant federal law, they said was designed really for crop pests, nursery pests, forestry pests. We didn't do ecological problems under the Noxious Weed Act, they said. But the administration was receptive to trying to do something about invasions, and so we sent in this petition in the fall of 1998. By 1999, it was listed, the first marine species and I think the first alga to be prohibited under the Noxious Weed Act. And then in 2000, we discovered it in 2 lagoons in Southern California. It probably had been established already. And what ensued, because we had gotten this listed under the Noxious Weed Act, the agencies involved, the US Department of Agriculture, the California Department of Food and Agriculture, were able to quickly mount an eradication effort, which has gone on for several years, cost several $million, but seems to be successful in having removed this potentially very harmful plant from 2 lagoons in Southern California. And so we believe it is no longer present anywhere in California. So aquarium invaders. And aquaculture is another mechanism. It doesn't move as many species around the world as ballast water does, but aquaculture is particularly good at moving around diseases and parasites and pests of fish and shellfish that are commercially valuable and that we care about. What we see in this photograph is a California abalone that has been reared in an abalone farm, a healthy red abalone from California. And what we see here is a red abalone reared in an abalone farm in California that has become infested by a South African shell parasite that was brought in by some abalone farmer who wanted to see if he could grow these South African abalone or hybridize them with the California ones, not entirely clear. It doesn't really harm the South African abalone, but it really wreaks havoc with the California ones. This abalone is no longer putting on any soft tissue, no muscle at all anymore. It's putting all its energy into growing bad shell. It has no respiratory holes, it's deformed, it's much too high profiled for the amount of muscle that it has, easily pulled off by waves or by predators, and the shell itself is so perforated by the parasite that it can be broken apart in the hand. So this is an organism that would no longer do very well out in the environment, and it wasn't much good in the abalone farms because it wasn't putting on any more muscle, which is what they sell. And a number of abalone farms, all of them eventually became infested with this parasite. A number of them went bankrupt as a result, and it got out into the environment in at least one site where, fortunately, we were able to remove it. Aquaculture traditionally moved a lot of parasites around. Oyster aquaculture was one of the most prolific movers of exotic species around the world. Aquaculture practices are more careful today than they were in the past, but as this example and other examples show, we're still moving very damaging diseases of fish and shellfish around the world in aquaculture. And then one last vector that's one that I've worked on and one of my favorites, most surprising vectors. This is Stanley Fairservice of the Fairservice Bait Company of Wiscasset, Maine, holding in his hands one of his 2 main products, a box containing what we call on this coast pileworms. It turns out that if you go fishing in marine waters or estuarine waters in California and you buy marine worms to fish with, that would either be pileworms or bloodworms, that those worms all come from in or near Booth Bay Harbor, Maine. There's a long-standing worm digging industry in Maine, in that area, and they supply all of the marine bait worms that are used in California. After I snapped Stanley's picture, he put the lid on this box and loaded it and another 100 or so boxes that he'd packed up this morning into the back of a van that his son-in-law then drove down to Logan Airport in Boston, loaded onto an afternoon flight. It arrived in San Francisco in this box, SFO, this side up, keep cool, live worms. Arrived at the San Francisco airport that evening, was picked up the next morning by a bait dealer who distributed it around to bait shops throughout the San Francisco Bay Area, where these worms were on sale to anglers, in some cases within 24 hours of being packed up on the coast of Maine. The worms are a concern in and of themselves, but the worms are packed in seaweed that is also gathered on the coast of Maine, and the seaweed carries within it a very impressive assortment of virtually every intertidal organism found on the coast of Maine. Isopods, amphipods, barnacles, clams, snails, you name it, it's in the seaweed, and it's coming into the San Francisco Bay and other parts of California in very large numbers. The state actually, when we wanted to find out about this, you have to have a license to import bait into California. So we went to under the laws of the state of California. So we went to Fish and Game to find out how many importing permits there were and how much was brought in and what statistics they had on it. And they said, okay, wait a minute, we'll look that up for you. And they said, nobody holds any permits to import bait into California, to import bait worms into California. And so, and that's still the case. Recently, I'm told that still they have no idea. There are no permits for importing these worms, but the trade has continued to go on. Every bait worm sold in marine bait worm sold in California is brought in from Maine. And so we went out and we interviewed and surveyed and bait dealers and the bait shops and the anglers to try and put this picture together. And it turns out that, at the end of the day, many anglers will take their leftover bait and seaweed and dump it in the ocean, thinking that they're returning native organisms into San Francisco Bay, go free little worm. And others that are fishing in the intertidal zone, they get their worm in little boxes with the seaweed and the worms in it, and they'll stick it under a rock in the shade so the worms stay healthy. And then when they're done, some of them just leave it there. Either they forget or they're neglectful or they're leaving it for the next fisherman to come along. But in any event, you can go out through San Francisco Bay on almost any day in the summer to popular fishing spots and find these little boxes. These are little invasive species starter kits. These worms have been kept cool and kept in the shade, and the seaweed and the snails and the clams in them, and they're all happy down there in the intertidal zone. And we know of at least 4 species that seem to have become established in San Francisco Bay as a result of this trade. And by our estimates, of single species, there are individual species of snail, for instance, of which there are tens of thousands of these arriving alive and being released into San Francisco Bay every single year as a result of this trade. So I like this one a lot. I need to move now to, let's see, I want to get rid of the slides. Is anyone watching how much time I've got left? Or 10 minutes? Good. That's great. Let me kill this and start this up. So the trade in marine bait worms. We recently got a paper that we're working on. We decided to ask ourselves, okay, so that's what's going on in California. What's happening around the world? And it turns out there is an international trade in marine bait worms. I had no idea. Bait worms are more expensive dollar for pound than virtually any seafood that is sold. And it's a very lucrative business. And with the globalization of the world and the increase of shipping between markets, we are seeing the phenomenon that is shown here. The numbers up here are actually keyed to different species. There are at least 13 worm species that we've identified that are traded around the world between countries or between oceans. They move around between 9 coastal bioregions, major trade routes, at least 26 countries, although it's certainly going to be more than that, 26 that we've identified so far, involved in this trade of worms around the world. The worms themselves, and in many cases, the packing material that they're in, have the possibility to move organisms around the world. An interesting vector. So usually when I gave this talk in the past, initially, I used to stop at about this point, whatever I was talking about in terms of the mechanisms for moving around. We didn't have this particular data, but I'd say, okay, that's the picture, sum it up, and that would be the end of the talk. Now you understand exotic species. And inadvertently, I found people told me I was leaving people with a sense of hopelessness. It's such a huge problem, and the system is so invaded, and how can anything be done? And that's exactly the opposite of my feeling about this. This is an environmental problem. It is a big environmental problem, but we have yet done virtually nothing about it, which means that we can make enormous inroads into this problem. We can't do much about getting rid of the species that have already arrived, as it turns out, in marine systems. In a few cases we can, but often that will be difficult or impossible. But we can do an awful lot about the effects of globalization if we choose to. And so what I want to talk about is some of the ways, very briefly, in which I've been involved in, and in which California has been very instrumental in moving forward policy with regard to ballast water. So ballast water is, of course, the big invasion mechanism for marine and freshwater systems that has gotten most of the news coverage. And the federal government got involved in trying to regulate it starting in the 1990s after the Eurasian zebra mussel showed up in the Great Lakes of North America. This is a freshwater clam. It grows in huge numbers. Among other things, it likes to grow inside water pipes. It stops the flow of water to cities and factories and coal and nuclear-fired power plants. And so it causes a lot of concerns, or did cause a lot of concerns in the Great Lakes. And they geared up to try and deal with this, and they the congressional representatives from the Great Lakes regions got Congress to pass a law that required the ships that enter into the Great Lakes from overseas to exchange their ballast water out at sea, what we call mid-ocean ballast water exchange. And so basically the idea is that these ships would be coming across the ocean with ballast water in their ballast tanks somewhere far out at sea, far enough that we call it the middle of the ocean, usually more than 200 miles offshore. They dump their coastal water out and thus get rid of all the coastal organisms, which are what we think could become established on our coasts. And they take aboard mid-ocean water, which only contains mid-ocean organisms, which we think will not do very well in coastal regions. And this is what they dump out into our harbors and port areas before they take on cargo. And so that's the idea. And so this was required of ships in the Great Lakes that enter into the Great Lakes, a relatively small number of vessels coming from overseas in the early 1990s. In 1996, partly as a result of the studies that I referenced in San Francisco Bay showing that this was a problem, a big problem outside of the Great Lakes, the push was on to make this a nationwide law. And it was, except instead of requiring ships to do mid-ocean exchange, the 1996 law passed by Congress made it voluntary for ships to do mid-ocean exchange. It said, here are some voluntary guidelines. We'd like you to do them, but we're not going to require you to actually do mid-ocean exchange. I was very disappointed after 1996. There was an enormous rhetoric. I was a part of that as a scientist working on invasions in San Francisco Bay about what a big problem this was and how we really needed to get to grips with it. And we needed to pass this law and deal with it. In the end, the Congress made it officially voluntary for the shipping industry to do anything about these discharges. And I was not satisfied, and other people in California, who tend to be somewhat more activist, I think, both in the agencies and in the environmental community than back in Washington, decided they weren't satisfied with it. And in 1999, California passed its own ballast water law, which made it mandatory for ships to exchange their ballast water out at sea. It wasn't clear that states had the power to do this, but California went ahead and did it anyway. The following year, Washington passed a similar law, the state of Washington. The following year, Oregon passed another law, and then finally in 2004, the federal government made it nationwide that ships were required to exchange their ballast water at sea. So far, so good. California leading on this issue as it has on so many environmental issues. But mid-ocean exchange is not very effective, unfortunately. A large number of organisms are left in the water despite this. They never manage to get rid of all the water, and it's very difficult to monitor. Overall, at best, if you believe that ships are that the ship's reports of how often they're doing this are true, we're still only getting rid of about 3/4 of the organisms, which means about 1/4 of what was coming in is still coming in. It's pretty unlikely, since there's essentially no monitoring to check on it, that the ship's self-reporting about the exchange that they're doing is actually that accurate. And so it's long been recognized in ballast water, people working on ballast water, that what we need to do is move to treatment of ballast water to remove or kill organisms. The situation that we have, unfortunately, is that to a large part, the agencies responsible for this, along with the shipping industry, have taken the position that we cannot adopt regulations and set standards for ballast water treatment until we have a treatment system available. The problem is nobody's going to invest in developing a treatment system until there are regulations and standards to develop it for. There will be no market until there are regulations. And so we have this chicken and egg problem, which has left us in limbo, I think to some degree deliberately in limbo, for many years. And in the debate over this, I've been probably not intelligently raising my voice and saying two things. One is that this issue of we need to develop a technology before we can move forward is really a red herring. The task before us in dealing with these organisms in ballast water is to kill organisms that are trapped in a tank of water. This is something that the United States in the 21st century is capable of doing. We have the technology to do this. We know how to kill things. And if we want to, it's an engineering challenge to get the system to work right and work efficiently and deal with all the different organisms, but we don't need any new science to do this. We have in fact been doing it in water and wastewater treatment for a very long time on very large quantities of water. And as Linda mentioned briefly, I was a director of East Bay Mud, the water district here, which also has a wastewater treatment plant that it operates at the approach to the Bay Bridge. If you go south on I-80 past the turnoff to San Francisco. You can see and sometimes smell it. It's a large wastewater treatment plant, but not the biggest in the Bay Area. And the other thing I've been sort of pointing out is that not only is this a pretty straightforward thing, killing organisms in a tank of water, but the scale is really rather modest. It seems big when you think about a single ballast tank on a ship, which can be huge. If you think in terms of bathtubs full, it's a very large amount of water. But from my experience, which seemed to be unique in the ballast water debate, from a wastewater and water treatment perspective, it's really a pretty tiny problem. East Bay Mud's wastewater treatment plant treats 120 million cubic meters of water a year, drinking water even more than double that. And the figures we have, which are quite good at this point, is that there's only about 8 million cubic meters of ballast water being discharged into California waters every year. So if we could gather all the ballast water being discharged into California in one place, I'm not saying we can, but this is just to think about the scale. If we could, it could be treated in one rather small treatment plant. And it certainly can be treated in a set of micro-treatment plants in the different ports around California. And so really this is a fairly straightforward problem. The scale is manageable. There's no reason not to move forward. And last summer I had the opportunity to serve on an advisory panel for California. I brought these arguments to the advisory panel. These arguments got traction, finally. We moved forward. The panel was charged with trying to develop standards for ballast water treatment in California. And after a spring and summer of meeting, the advisory panel agreed to recommend what are the strongest ballast water standards that have been suggested anywhere in the world that will reduce the discharge of larger organisms to zero detectable organisms, and smaller organisms reduce them dramatically from what they are now. And broadly supported by the members of the advisory panel, the water agencies, the farm agencies, the environmental groups, the scientists, virtually all of the agency staff said, yes, this is what we need to do in California. The State Lands Commission eventually endorsed it, sent it to the legislature. We're working with the legislature to write legislation now. It seems very likely that California will adopt these laws this year. And it seems very likely, given the governor's situation, that he will sign such a law, given this kind of support, will sign such a bill into law. And so once again, there's an opportunity for California to take the lead on this issue. This will be important not just for California. This will set the standard for what can be done for the entire nation and internationally. The same thing is true of all these other vectors. We have the capacity here in California, because of the public interest, because of the public support, because of the dire nature of the problem in San Francisco Bay, to take stands on these issues that will make a difference not just here, but throughout the world. And with that, I will conclude my talk and be happy to answer any questions. Close this off here. Are there lights, and are there any questions? There's a question in the back here.
I have a question about that interesting exponential graph that you showed of the number of species being introduced over a period of time. Is it really that smooth, or do things go in fits and starts?
Well, let me try and remember exactly how we did that one. The curve that I showed there was our best estimate based on year of discovery of each of those organisms when they were first reported in San Francisco Bay. So it was, in fact, there are, I mean, it's not completely smooth, but it's, you know, it's over 200 organisms, and so it tends to smooth it out. We also did that, one of the concerns about that approach to doing it is that when we discover an organism isn't necessarily when it arrived, and so we were concerned that there might be a bias introduced into that curve by the lag between the actual arrival of an organism and its discovery. So we went back through that and we removed basically all the diciest data points, the things where a sponge specialist came in and suddenly described 4 new exotic sponges in 1 year, or where we did some surveys and discovered a whole bunch of new things in recent years, or where there were particularly cryptic organisms which could have been around for a long time without being discovered. And so we ended up removing about 1/3 of the data points, and we ended up with another curve which, because there were less points, was choppier, but had essentially the same shape. The issue has been reviewed in a number of critical papers that eventually all concluded that the method was valid and that really is an exponential increase. It's surprising to me. I didn't expect to find that. The mechanisms, those historic mechanisms that I described, the number of fouling organisms that must have been moving around on the hulls of wooden ships in the old days, and the number of things that were moved around in oysters back before we took any effort to try and remove organisms out must have been phenomenal. And so I expected to find a larger rate of invasion earlier, and so this was exactly the opposite of what I'd expected. So we looked at it pretty skeptically. Question?
Do you know of any areas in the world that have been invaded by San Francisco natives?
Yes, we get asked this question, and sort of a project which hasn't gotten to the top of the pile, but which I do some work on every now and then, is to try and make lists of things that have moved from here elsewhere. And there are a number of such things. The common intertidal barnacle Ballast glandula is in Argentina. There's a Pachygrapsis, not Pachygrapsis, Pyromia tuberculata, which is a California crab, mainly in Southern California, but also in Californias in Japan. And there's a fair list of such things. It doesn't seem to be as many as have come here, but it's not just a one-way street. Question?
Guinness Book of Records question. What are the attributes that make this the most, what was the phrase you used?
The most invaded estuary in the world?
Invaded estuary. I've thought of a number of other estuaries that I would think would be likely candidates.
Likely candidates, like New York City Harbor or something like that? Chesapeake Bay or something like that. They don't seem to be as invaded as San Francisco Bay. I mean, I'm not sure San Francisco Bay is literally the most invaded estuary in the world, because these studies haven't been done on all of them. But it's certainly the most invaded by, when you sort of take all these things together, the number of species, the dominance in different habitats, the biomass in particular, San Francisco Bay seems to really outweigh all of them, virtually all of them by a large margin, and all of them by at least some significant margin. And there's a lot of speculation about why that is. We talk about it briefly in our 1998 paper. There's been statements that the fauna of San Francisco Bay was depauperate. The West Coast fauna is depauperate, and there are very few native species, and therefore it was easy for things to invade. It's not clear, although it makes common sense, it really hasn't been shown by the data that areas that have limited populations of native species are more easily invaded. That's sort of an assumption in that. But it's also not clear that San Francisco Bay is more depauperate than other bays, for example, on the Pacific coast, or some of the New England bays, which were under ice 10,000 years ago. So there's there's a combination of arguments that I'm combining here, which is it's young and it's depauperate. And so both of those things have been raised. So it's not younger, for example, than some estuaries. It's not necessarily more depauperate than others several others along the West Coast and elsewhere. And it's not clear that there's really a connection between those things, although it makes common sense. The statistical evidence isn't out there. The other thing that's been argued is that it's so disturbed a system that it's so easily invaded. Again, is San Francisco Bay more disturbed than New York Harbor? There's this assumption here that the underlying premise is questionable, as well as the connection. And then the third sort of aspect is the one that I have focused on, is the number of vectors, the number of mechanisms that are bringing things into San Francisco Bay. There do seem to have been a lot. I'm not sure it's enough to account for the degree to which it is a more invaded species. I'm not sure that's inadequate to totally explain it, but I'm convinced that it's a part of it. There aren't that many places in the world that have received large inputs of oysters from two completely different parts of the world. The East Coast has so far not received oysters, has received some European oysters, but not large inputs. Japanese oysters have been moved to many parts of the world, but few of them have also received oysters from the Atlantic, as San Francisco Bay did. So there we have two major vectors. Certainly shipping has been a major vector. We've had ships coming both from the Atlantic because of the position of this being a US port and important for trade from the Atlantic, and now an awful lot of trade from the Pacific Rim. And so you can make the argument that the vectors are bigger here.
Could I add one more?
Sure thing.
The otter was removed from the bay about 30 years before the gold rush. And so I think that the bay was a disturbed ecosystem at that time.
It was, but there are many disturbed. I mean, I don't know whether it's more disturbed than others. I mean, the question is that an explanation, or at least the initial question is that why it is more invaded than other estuaries? So there were a lot of changes in the estuary. from early on, some of which we don't recognize that much. So a lot of people forget the otter. It was probably here in very large numbers, probably had pretty substantial effect on the ecosystem. The arrival of Caucasians in California was in the advance of the movement of Caucasians in California. There was a wave of disease that wiped out the native populations. And those native populations, among other things, were very effective at harvesting salmon out of the rivers. And so with the change in the native populations, so some of the abundance of salmon that we saw in the early years of the estuary may have, in fact, been an artifact of the removal of the people who were fishing for them. And so all of these things are disturbances. And so it's hard to say. But yet other areas also have undergone great disturbances from an early date, and yet are not as invaded as San Francisco Bay.
Two-part question. You can ignore whichever one you prefer. First is, you said that it was relatively inexpensive to treat all this ballast water, and I'm curious what kinds of treatment technologies people have in mind and what the costs look like. And the second one has to do with whether it would be seen as an impediment to international trade and treaties that the United States government is party to.
I'm not sure I said it was relatively expensive. I think the technology is there and it's available, and there are relatively inexpensive technologies that are used to treat water and wastewater all the time, and we just incorporate those expenses into our daily life. Whether it's inexpensive or expensive, I suppose, is a matter of your attitude. It's a human judgment. There's no scientific one can make about that. But if the water were to be moved onshore, it would be pretty easy to deal with that. The advisory committee that I was a part of looked at this as best we could. One of the most interesting studies was actually commissioned by the shipping industry, by the California Association of California Association of Port Authorities. Anyways, something like that. They had the work done by URS, an engineering firm, and the work was to try and figure out how much it would cost to do onshore treatment of ballast water. So they figured on putting plants at each port and putting in piping systems and getting the water off the ships, and a treatment system that I think involved filtration followed by UV to kill the stuff that wasn't filtered out. And the annual cost was like $8 million for the entire state of California, which, is a lot of money for me, but from the perspective of water and wastewater treatment, it's kind of peanuts. And that number is probably low. I think they made some errors in the way they figured out their annualized cost. There were some costs they didn't include, but even if it's 10 times that cost, it still seems like a doable number. And so this advisory panel eventually concluded that, it's going to cost something, no question, and the shipping industry would rather not pay those costs if it could, but these aren't going to break the back of the shipping industry. The shipping industry also is undergoing an astonishing boom with the globalization in this industry. Some years it does better, some years not so good, but over a long time now and for a foreseeable long time, the shipping industry is in a boom phase, and so if you're going to have them invest in the infrastructure to do something like that, this is the time. And I suppose that's my answer to I don't really know how this is going to play out with international treaties. There's a lot of environmental problems that run aground on international markets these days. And so conceivably this could, although it's different from many of the things which are argued as being protectionist laws, and because it simply applies to the shipping practices themselves rather than the goods. And so I think there's at least a good reason to think that they won't run aground. Question?
Are there cases where exotic organisms that have become established in the San Francisco Estuary have spread to other places in California?
Sure.
Through water conveyance?
Through water conveyances?
Yeah.
To some degree. That doesn't happen. There is some of that, but it doesn't happen that often. Many of the things in the bay are estuarine, so they're brackish water. The systems are fresh water. Some of the fresher water things do get into the water conveyances and move around. There's a one goby which may have been transferred to Southern California as a result, which probably was transferred to Southern California in the water conveyances and so on. So they do get around that way, and then other mechanisms do move organisms from San Francisco. Boats that move between bays and harbors and other mechanisms do move them around. Question?
Seems the rules of intelligent design say that something good has to come out of this from somewhere. Is there anything good that comes out of this?
Sure. This is a question about values, and values ultimately, I mean, what's good, what's bad, is a question which is based on what do people value. Ultimately, science doesn't really answer this one, and there are introduced fish that people fish for and eat and are happy that they're here. Those introduced fish also have an impact on native species, and so if you're concerned about native species, you know, it depends on whether they're good or bad for the native species as to whether you think that particular organism is good. So I think there's this, you know, good fish, bad fish question, as I put it, that one can argue about each individual species. And some people will find this to be a good, some a bad. It sort of depends on where they go. When I first started talking about this issue, I gave a keynote address down at, there's an annual conference at Asilomar about the San Francisco Bay Delta ecosystem. And they asked me to come in and talk about exotic species. And I spent a lot of time talking about the, in addition to these other vectors, about the introduction of fish into California and about the introduction of striped bass, which are an exotic fish introduced from New Jersey in 1879 and became the commercially most valuable fish in the Bay Delta system. First commercially fished and then as a recreational fish. And in the early 1990s, it was, the striped bass was held up by environmental groups as the indicator species for the health of San Francisco Bay. If the striped bass is doing well, the bay is doing well, they said. But since the striped bass isn't doing well, we know the bay is doing badly. And it didn't occur to them that there might be something funny about using an exotic species as the indicator species. Anyway, so we can, anyway, at this Asilomar thing, there were some fisheries biologists in California Fish and Game, particularly, who were deeply offended by my discussion of the impacts of striped bass, the potential impacts of striped bass on the native ecosystems. They do eat salmon, young. There are large numbers of striped bass in the system. They are big predators. It's hard to believe that they didn't have an impact on some of the fish species here. But the idea that anyone could say anything bad about a striped bass was something that these people could not bear to hear. That has changed, I think, over the last decade, and there's sort of this more general recognition that this is really a problem. So there's the good fish, bad fish thing, but there are a couple of other things about the introduction of species that I think are universally bad, depending on what your values are. One of it is that if you value native ecosystems, you value the area having its native complement of organisms, something as close to that and as close to a native functioning as you can, and as distinct from other ecosystems that have evolved different sets of organisms as we found originally, then this movement of organisms around the world, the intrusion of exotic species into the system, the homogenation of different estuaries around the world is bad. In terms of that value, there's nothing good about moving exotic organisms around. The other thing is that, that even if you introduce something that turns out to be a good fish as opposed to a bad fish, it changes the system. And our human economic systems and our human activities have difficulty interacting with ecosystems that go through rapid changes. There are costs to that. Even if you bring in a fish, you've got a native fishery and you bring in an exotic fish which replaces it but is a better fishery and brings in more money, there's a cost to shifting over. There are these initial transactions costs, I suppose, or that you might call them. There are other kinds of costs, and I referred to this here. We had years, I believe decades of data on how the San Francisco Bay ecosystem worked in the northern part of the estuary. Models developed, tons of work done, sampling done to try and understand this so we could manage our water withdrawal so it didn't harm the system. And then this clam, Corbula amurensis, appears. A year later, it's the most abundant clam in the system. The functioning of the ecosystem completely changes, and we have a completely different ecosystem. And all that knowledge is now worthless. We started over from scratch, and we've been unable to get back to where we were in the 1980s in understanding the system because new things are continuing to come in all the time. And so our ability to manage these systems, I think, erodes as we do this. So there are a number of ways in which I think it's just a bad, and then there are individual species where you can argue good fish, bad fish.
I would like to say, I am a foreign species here.
We have many, as many of us are.
It's kind of interesting. It's a sort of tongue-in-cheek sort of statement that here we are passing judgment about zebra mussels and all these mussels, overbite mussels and so forth, and how good they are necessary to encourage the local population. Yeah, and here we have the human species. They have completely warped and skewed the system. I think it's something to think about. I don't have an answer.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have thought about it because it has arisen in the debates. There are arguments that have been made, not by scientists, I don't think, but by others who I think have a stake in the issue, that basically all of this is a kind of racist attitude, and they use those words, on the part of scientists who, you know, who categorize, you know, aliens just as they would human beings, and I think it's a completely different argument. I don't think there's really anything to it. The issue about organisms is very different from the issues around human beings. It's interesting to think about it, I suppose, but I think it is a very different world entirely. The questions that we approach about how we want to manage our ecosystems are very separate from the questions of human immigration. It is true that the movement of human beings around the world is part of what moves organisms around the world, but I think you need to judge those things separately. You need to figure out what your immigration policy is and your attitudes about that based upon human needs. And then if there's a movement of organisms that goes along with that, then you find ways to deal with that. But it's really a separate issue. And I respond to it because it actually has been part of the debate. And these kinds of attacks have been made on people who, I think, in good faith, have been making the argument that these things are bad for ecosystems in some cases. They are bad for species that we care about. We are moving, in, among other things, parasites around the world. And this is what we ought to stop, not the movement of human beings, but the inadvertent movement of the organisms that we don't want to move around the world. I hope you don't mind. I mean, it's surprising to me that this has become part of the larger debate, but it has been out there in the national press and so on. And it is something that we have to deal with when we argue that, you know, really we ought to be doing something about these invasions, as I believe. Question in the back?
Two curiosities. What do you think has been the effect of, and this is historically quite a while back, of filling in the bay and sort of, you know, crushing the intertidal zone as that occurred? And also placer mining. I work with some people who do Peterson mud grabs in the Berkeley flats, and the silt level changes, you know, every time the tide changes. And it goes up like about 1.5 inches. And we don't really see these overripe clams. We just see a change in the bottom. I wondered if you had any thoughts about what effect those things have.
You know, I don't really have anything to say about how the filling in of the bay affected it. I mean, the ecosystems are complicated, and the filling of the bay certainly has had an effect on the hydrodynamics of the bay, on the loss of certain types of habitat or changes in their abundance. But it's not, if there is a straightforward relationship between that and encouraging or discouraging invasions, more or fewer or types of invasions, it's not clear to me that there is one. So I don't really have anything. No doubt there is an effect, but these are very complicated ecosystems, and no one has yet teased out what that effect might be. With regard to mining, there has at least been some suggestions that the hydraulic mining in the late 1800s is related to the establishment of at least a couple of fish species, and that the sediment that came down in huge amounts from hydraulic mining reduced the populations of salmonids, which lay their eggs in redds in gravel beds in the river, and they were buried, and the oxygenation of these beds was decreased because of the amount of sediment in the water. Whereas fish like striped bass and shad that had eggs that bounced along the bottom and didn't get buried were able to survive in this more turbid environment. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that argument has been made for at least those two species, that was an effect.
You don't see the more abundant invasive clam in the Berkeley flats?
In the intertidal flats?
Yeah.
It's primarily a subtidal organism. I've seen it intertidally, and I have seen it intertidally. Sometimes it's reasonably abundant. I've seen it extremely abundant only once in the intertidal zone. It's primarily a subtidal one, so that presumably is why you're not seeing it there. And it's not common on the other side of the central bay, so as you get towards the mouth of the bay, it's not common. But I've seen it in some years in fairly large numbers at Crown Beach, for example, in intertidal areas, and off in subtidal areas there as well. Question?
So the delay in turnaround time, do the vessels have to undergo, when they come to the port, then they have to go to a shore facility and pump out and change the ballast water?
How long would it take them to offload ballast water, and how much of a delay? Well, it depends upon the system. It depends on how big a pipe you put in, how big a manifold, and how big a pump you put in, essentially, as to how long it takes. There are other issues about the arrangement of the ship and sort of having to hook up another pipe and things like that, which may be part of the delay. But we do know that for example, vessels currently move large quantities of liquid cargo, including flammable and toxic and sometimes explosive cargo on and off vessels in very short order, and in terms of oil tankers and chemical carrying tankers. And some oil tankers that carry ballast water in their cargo tanks when they're in ballast end up, so they don't have special tanks for carrying ballast water. They carry oil in one direction, and then they load the same tanks with water in the other direction as ballast. That water is contaminated, and they're required to offload that in some locations into an onshore treatment facility, and they do that. How long a delay, it really depends on the system you set up. The mechanisms are well developed there for doing this rapidly and efficiently and safely, and so no doubt there will be some added cost to doing it. But again, it seems probably manageable. Question?
Do you sense a tension between the arguments for biodiversity, which is presumably like the benefit and utility of the environmental function that certain species have as far as recycling or sequestering metals or things like that, versus the drive to limit invasive species? Like it seems like a very sparse environment with not a lot of native species might be judged differently if you look at it from the utility of the environmental.
Well, we get a lot from our ecosystems. A lot of it, I think, is spiritual or educational in value, and I think that has been very important, and we shouldn't pretend it isn't. We get other things like fisheries. We use them for navigation. Some of them have a high economic value. Some of them have very high value, but it's not easily priced. And these are the other things, the sort of this aesthetic, spiritual, educational, scientific value of these things. And so like all of these things, I guess, could be called utilities. And some of them are harmed to the extent that they are based on having native ecosystems. They are harmed by exotic species. To the extent that individual species that we care about are harmed or benefited, they may be harmed or benefited by the introduction of exotic species. And you can go in and sort of do an analysis in an ecosystem. I think it would be very interesting to do one for San Francisco Bay and try and look at all the various kinds of impacts that exotic species have had, from the shipworm that eliminated the maritime infrastructure in the northern part of the bay back in the 1920s, to the effects of Corbulae amurensis on our ability to manage this ecosystem and so on, and yet also a number of exotic species that people fish for and value. But no one has yet done that. I've tried to get some economists and perhaps people other than economists involved in trying to take a look at that, because it's not all economic questions. I think it's worth looking at. I don't have an answer on what the number is. Are we about there?
I think so. Maybe time for one last question? Okay.
Please.
Any thoughts about biocontrol and terrestrial invasive species biocontrol is used a lot?
Strong thoughts about biocontrol. The conference where I learned about, the workshop where I learned about this killer algae, Caulerpa taxifolia, and its availability in aquariums and in aquarium stores in the United States, was a conference up in Washington about biocontrol of marine organisms. Should we do it, should we not? And there were 4 case studies, and one of them was this algal invasion of the Mediterranean, and should some sea slugs be introduced that would eat that algae. And in the hallroom conversations, I learned that we were still selling it in this country, and I thought, great to think about controlling it, how we're going to control it, but maybe we should try to keep it from getting here. There are advocates of biocontrol in the marine realm. I think it might be possible in some cases. I think it should be approached very cautiously. I think there's a lot of hype about the value of biocontrol myself. There are certainly cases where biocontrol has achieved stunning successes in terrestrial environments. But my sense from reading the literature is there aren't that many, and they tend to get quoted again and again and again. And much more common are sort of ambiguous situations where there may be some benefit, or it's not really clear, or maybe there wasn't any benefit. And then the failures tend to be less reported than the successes, so it's a little hard to sort it all out. In the meantime, of course, every organism introduced into the environment has the potential to do harm or good, and these are new organisms we'd be introducing out there. And so I tend to be a bit of a skeptic, not a complete one. Some of these exotic organisms do cause big harms. If we can come up with an appropriate biocontrol that seems to be reasonably safe, it may be worth doing. I'm worried about the fact that most of the biocontrol people who are promoting it, whom I've met, seem to ignore the possibility of harm. The statements I hear, well, if we can prove in the laboratory it's safe, then why not put it out there? And the answer is, you know, what you learn in the laboratory can never tell you what that organism really is going to do out in the environment. It can give you a good guess about certain aspects, but there are many aspects that simply cannot be tested in the laboratory. And so it's never safe. It's always a question of some risk and balancing it against the benefit. And I find a reluctance to do that among what I would say are the people promoting biocontrol in marine systems. And so I'm uneasy about moving forward until we have a more sort of appropriately skeptical view of how we do these things. There have been a few cases that have been looked at. There is one insect that has been released actually up in Willapa Bay, taken from San Francisco Bay, carries, I think, a bacterial pathogen, which attacks an exotic cordgrass up there, the same cordgrass we have down here. I think that biocontrol was a pretty safe one for a number of reasons, but I think it was badly done. And I think it could have been a useful tool. It turned out to have done very little, and the risk was there of something going wrong. But that's the only biocontrol that I'm aware of in the marine realm itself to date.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you for having me, Tara.